My name is Ryan Perry, of course. I'm the Digital Collections Librarian here at CLRC. And Ashley, we want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Yes, I'm Ashley, and I'm the Digital Projects and Preservation Librarian.
Yeah, and so Ashley handles our DigLab projects. So again, welcome everyone. I want to do introductions because one of the things we miss out with having all of our events pretty much virtual these days is you guys don't get to interact with each other. So I know that was like very superficial, but it's nice to at least have everybody say their name and where they are. So I appreciate that. So the purpose of this webinar is to discuss our Access and Digitization grants, which we give out every year. We have a quick run through of the agenda, just so everybody kind of knows where we're headed. I'll go through some general grant information. I'll identify, I'll talk about like the process of identifying projects for these grants. Many of you have probably already thought about stuff, but this might be something to consider as you're moving forward or trying to pick between several options. We'll discuss our in-house digitization program through our DigLab, which unfortunately we're taking a pause on, but I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. I'm going to give a couple of project examples and talk through kind of what they look like, so you kind of have an idea of what's worked in the past. I'll take a quick pass through the grant timeline, which hopefully is very straightforward, just to make sure everybody understands that process. And then I will finish by going through the application itself and just kind of clicking through and talking about what each question means and what we're looking for. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through all this. So again, please interrupt me if you have questions. But I really, I think this is valuable because the goal of this and the goal of this whole project is we want to do as much as we can for all of you to submit the best possible projects so that we can give an easy thumbs up and have our committees approve them. So the more you guys know about our process, hopefully the better you're able to put forth a project that's fully formed and an easy yes, which is our goal. So our Access and Digitization grants used to be referred to as RBDB grants by the category of funding that we got through the state. But it's now kind of simplified on that end. So we renamed them Access and Digitization grants in part to give them more of a descriptive title, so we can hopefully make it clear what we're looking for. We have $30,000 this year set aside in our budget for projects. This is a little bit more simplified than in previous years because that's $35,000 total. We don't have the same set of additional funds that we've had in previous years. So I suspect that will make these a little bit more competitive than they have been some years. In the past, we've tended to fund, at least in part, all viable projects. This year, we'll have to see how much comes through and what our review committee thinks of it. In order to be eligible for a grant, you must be a member in good standing of CLRC. So all of you on this call currently are, but for anybody watching, that would be, if you aren't already a member, you would have to exist, be located in one of our 4 counties, and we can prorate dues. So, and I think actually some of you folks on this call joined kind of part of the way through, so you were eligible for the last round of grants. And we were pretty good at working through, and we'll just charge you the remainder of the year if you end up joining. These your grant applications are will be reviewed by our Library Resources and Services Committee, which is made up of representatives from our members, and they'll go through all the applications and judge them mostly on their worthiness and also of course their plan and their budget and all that. And then their recommendations are then reviewed by an external committee, which are made up of colleagues of Ashley and I from other library councils. And that helps us kind of catch anything that we might miss by being too close to some of your projects. And then the final step is the CLRC board approves those recommendations and will notify you of the results. So the one of the benefits of this structure, is that Ashley and I can help advocate on behalf of your projects. We aren't the ones making the decisions, but the more information you give us and the more you work with us as you're planning and putting forth the project, the more we're able to explain it to the committees and the board, and that helps in the long run quite a bit. So there's a couple of different categories of project that we tend to see, and I'm going to just talk about it kind of in the abstract. So the big one is digitization. So these are this would be the conversion of an analog resource or something that exists physically into a digital copy. So this is the most common type of project we have, that you're starting from an existing resource, digitizing it, creating metadata, and uploading it to a repository. We can work with a very wide format or a range of formats, both like the type of material you have and where it ends up. We're able to be pretty flexible about that, but really the focus is on creating access. So this is an appropriate grant for a project that would be really of internal use or of use, or projects you don't have copyright permission to share, which I'm going to touch on quite a bit later. This is really, these funds were originally intended, and we still use them toward promoting access to historical and cultural heritage materials.
Question, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
So when we're talking about publicly accessible, doesn't mean that anyone can access it from anywhere, just that there is a way that the public can have access and get a copy of these records.
Generally speaking,
by a
we
website,
are talking. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, you finish.
By a website, or like just by emailing, let's say me, and I then can be like, yes, here's a copy of it.
Yeah, so we are looking at stuff that's accessible without mediation. So like,
okay,
we would want something up in a repository where you wouldn't have to email to ask for it. That doesn't mean that, that pretty much, it would need, if it's not ending up in New York Heritage or New York State Historic newspapers, it would have to end up in a repository that has structure. So not even just like pictures on a website, but like more of a, metadata requirements, which I'm going to get into in the next slide. So yeah, that's a good question. So we are, it should be able to be accessed by the public without having to ask for it, and without having any paywalls or any other impediments like that. So that is an important thing, and that's what that looks like. We can often discuss. So like there's room for flexibility there, but it needs to be somewhere that it's accessible. Actually, the last point I have on here it kind of expands on that. So some organizations do have their own digital asset management system. So like a website that has repository structure, not just like a WordPress site, but like something that has like, can be searchable and
right. It has like an interface that can be used to search the database that contains the records. Yes,
that's a good way of saying it. Like, yeah. So like, again, if you have materials that aren't necessarily good fits for New York Heritage, it doesn't mean that they're not eligible for this grant. It just means that we would have to have a more in-depth conversation about where they're going to end up and how they're going to be accessible and all that. But that's, and I guess one thing I should back up and mention, even though you're coming to this webinar, I really encourage all of you, especially if you have edge cases or something that's not very straightforward, to reach out to Ashley or myself, and we can discuss kind of the particulars of your project. So especially if you're not like right down the center of what we're looking for, we can help A, work out and make sure that it's eligible, and B, explain how it is eligible to the review committees. So another type of project / another aspect of digitization is metadata. So metadata is data about data. So this is kind of the descriptive work or cataloging that happens to make digital assets accessible. So it helps describe things, and it helps fuel search and browsing the materials. So this especially applies for materials that might not end up in one of our repositories. We do require that your metadata, your descriptive practices follow nationally recognized standards. So this kind of feeds again into that repository structure that we're looking for. We really just we want things to be easily accessible, not just siloed away, and have it be hard for people to find the materials. While the majority of projects that we end up funding are digitization projects that have a metadata component, so you have to catalog or create the descriptions in order to put them up in a repository, we also do accept projects where the files are already there. You already have digital files. You just want to put them up in another repository or augment them or add to what you already have to make them more easily accessible. So this has looked, there's been a variety of ways this has looked in the past, and I can go through that and some of the examples I have later. Then the last point is, I'm like a broken record. It have to be accessible. This isn't something to create metadata for your content management system that you use internally. This is something that the public can access. So that's an important consideration for metadata as well. We aren't, fueling your collection management internally. This is an external facing project that we're looking for. There are a number of expenses that we don't support, and this is in part because these are smaller grants. These aren't, really large, all-encompassing grants that we're giving out. So we don't cover overhead costs like rent, heat, or electricity. We don't cover the purchase of new materials. So if you're digitizing materials, you need to already possess those materials, and sometimes that gets there's a little bit of gray area there when you're talking about like things like oral histories or community digitization projects. In those cases, we would want you to know exactly what you're handling before you do it. So we've turned down projects in the past that are like, we're going to ask the community to bring their stuff, and they don't know who in the community is coming and what stuff they're bringing. We really want to have it be something that you could give an inventory of what is going to be processed. Because those projects can be difficult to realize without having done a lot of that initial work, and B, it's harder to know what you're going to end up with and assess the project without knowing what the work's going to look like. We also don't support direct payments to libraries for interlibrary loan costs. So there's other programs in place for interlibrary loan. This is not a grant stream that handles that. And I realize now that I have acronyms on here that I probably should have spelled out. So we also don't allow for the purchase of an ILS, an integrated library system for individual libraries. So this wouldn't fund the creation of a repository. If you're talking about like creating an exhibit or something smaller, maybe, but we're not going to pay for a past perfect subscription as part of this, for instance. And then the next one, hours that an employee would already be working. This is a common subling block. So the purpose of these grants is to increase capacity. So we're not subsidizing existing salaries. So if you already have a full-time staff member who's going to be doing this work, we wouldn't pay that staff member to do work as part of that, 40 hours or whatever they're already working. So a lot of times this means if you're doing a project in-house, you might need to hire somebody part-time to do the work or to increase your capacity. That's really, trying to, it can be hard to work through that for some organizations, but really the end goal is that we want to increase your capacity. We don't want to just subsidize what you're already doing. The final one is, again, a broken record. We aren't able to fund projects that don't meet copyright requirements. So if you don't have the permission to share something, we aren't going to fund the digitization and metadata creation for those materials, because the end goal is to be able to share them. So that's why throughout the application process, it's very important that you have the proper permissions or the proper documentation for copyright. And we've gotten better over the years, but the number one question used to be, do they have copyright permission to do this amazing project that they're proposing? And if the answer was ambiguous, then we would sometimes not fund or have to wait until we had a clear answer on that to approve funding. Before I go on to the next thing, any other questions? Anything else that people want me to talk about in greater depth? Okay. So I'm going to talk on this slide a little bit about identifying projects. And again, many of you probably already have some ideas in mind, but maybe this will help narrow it down or tailor your project to fit our requirements. So number one, you want to make sure you're identifying materials that are appropriate to be shared publicly. This dovetails with our New York Heritage Collection Development Policy, which is linked to in these slides, which, by the way, I will share out the recording and the slides from this presentation, so you'll be able to click on that link later. That's really, we want materials, if they're going in New York Heritage, they need to be materials that are of interest to a general population. Again, things that really have an internal audience and don't have an external public audience aren't appropriate for these grants. And not only should you consider copyright, but also privacy or access restrictions. So if you have materials that were donated with explicit privacy restrictions or access restrictions, then obviously they shouldn't be digitized and made freely available on the internet. But sometimes there's ethical considerations here too. If you have medical records, for instance, that might have HIPAA restrictions, or even just sensitive materials that might result in some people being unhappy that their personal details were being shared, stuff like that. So again, it doesn't describe the majority of projects, but it might be a consideration if you're looking at a subset of materials in a collection. And then number two, if you're identifying projects, you might want to think about what the best way to process them is. So this gets to the activities of the grant, like who's going to be doing the work and how. And you might consider doing a project in-house and hiring an additional person or increasing somebody who's part-time, increasing their hours to do the project, or hiring a vendor. And there's three different factors that I identified here. So the first is material factors. So, what types of materials are you looking at? Do you have the equipment or the ability to handle, say, oversized materials, or the quantity of materials that you're talking about? Are they really in bad condition, right? You have to be especially careful in handling the materials. That's, of course, an important consideration as well. Staffing factors is probably the biggest one. So like what kind of time and talent do you have available to you? It's great to think about hiring an intern, and interns and temporary workers can often do amazing work, but there's an extra amount of training and supervision that is required that should be considered when you're looking at a project. And then informational factors really relate to the metadata creation or writing those descriptions. So How much of an expert do you need to be able to process the materials? Some things are very, very easy and self-describing. So like a yearbook project, for instance, the information about the yearbook and what it is right there on the cover or right there on the first couple of pages. Whereas a photograph that was in a shoebox for 50 years, you might not have the context or the information to know what it is in order to describe it. So something like that photograph might require a lot more subject knowledge of what it is and you know what's there, and that would of course be a consideration in terms of who's going to be describing it. And then the final and maybe the biggest one when you're asking for a grant is how much will it cost? So once you figured out, you know, who's doing the work and how they're doing it, we like to see a reasonable budget in terms of, you know, have you thought through how long this project's actually going to take? Are you accounting for your costs appropriately? We don't want you going over budget, and you know, we also don't want you going under budget and saying, okay, you know, you just want to make sure you're asking for a proportional amount for the project and that it seems reasonable. So the more you can show your math when you're submitting the budget, the better, because then we can kind of assess whether we agree with your math, instead of, you know, just saying we want $1,000 to digitize these 100 photographs and we don't know how you got to that number or whether or not that makes sense. And of course, I'll say this again, you know, please reach out to us and talk. We'd happy to talk through all these factors and all these things with you. We'd much rather help you figure that out in advance than have you submit an application that isn't reasonable or isn't realistic in terms of your goals and what you're hoping to accomplish. So this is kind of a different way of looking at that last slide. Successful applications will tend to have well thought out project plans. So I think there's a certain amount of, you want to be concise when you're filling out our application. We don't need so much information that it's hard to get to the crux of what you're asking for and what you're trying to do. But a fair amount of detail is helpful, because then we can again assess whether your plan is reasonable. Detailed, reasonable budgets. Again, show your math. If you show us your hourly rate and how many hours you're expecting a project to take, we can say whether or not it seems reasonable. Copyright clearance. We often, if it's something is in copyright, we would want you to reach out to the copyright holder and get written permission from them that you can then submit via email to me, and I'll attach it to your application. And we really want that copyright and any vendor quotes or any you know, documentation like that in advance, because again, a lot of these projects, it's really hard to assess whether or not they're viable without having copyright and the vendor quote, which will again show us their math in terms of how they're getting to their cost estimate. We like to see institutions have previous projects completed successfully and on time. There's a big asterisk next to that one for you know, the pandemic and a lot of disruptions with staffing. We're behind on our projects. And we are, of course, understanding with projects that are behind from other people as well. Of course, you know, if you haven't done it, if you got a grant from us 3 years ago and haven't done anything on it, that probably doesn't look very good. But, you know, within reason, we do have deadlines and we do have a timeline for these projects, but we're going to be, you know, reasonable in working with you all on those timelines. And then kind of, on a similar note, you know, having your reports done on time. Our reports are very simple. I think our final report is 5 questions, and it really amounts to what did you end up actually doing? How did that differ from what you had planned to do? And do you have any feedback or advice on the process? That's really, you know, we're not looking for a 30-page manuscript on you know, or a detailed. We don't need receipts or a budget back. We just want to know what you had accomplished and how it went. So most people could probably fill out their final report in 10 minutes or less. Another thing to consider is that large projects can be split across multiple years. So I'll have some examples of this in the future, but we don't require that. You know, we have a $10,000 maximum for projects, and I think that's really going to be, you know, we're really expecting to give out some smaller awards this year that, you know, I don't know as we'll have any $10,000 projects if we only have $30,000 total. So it's reasonable to say, okay, we're going to pick off the first part of this project, and our plans for continuing it are next year we'll apply for the next part of it. And that's been common over the years, and we encourage that. I do encourage everybody to go, and I'll show this in a little bit when I go through the application, but we have the last 3 years of projects listed at the bottom of the grant page, and you can kind of see who has asked for what and how much. And of course, you're seeing the surface level, you don't know what the exact quantity is. So when we say, you know, they asked for $1,000 to digitize some photographs, you won't have all the detail behind that. But it does give a good sense for what types of projects and what types of amounts we've given out in the past.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What did you mean on the last slide by vendor documentation?
Sorry, what documentation?
Vendor
Vendor documentation. Okay, yeah. So that's really a vendor quote. So, or like any documents from the vendor about what they're going to do.
Okay, thanks.
So when OHA applied for that film project, we asked you to submit the quote so we could see exactly what they're charging and for how much and all that.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. To be clear, I should really say vendor quotes. So normally we do handle a good portion of our projects in-house. So Ashley has been working through the last couple of years of projects. And we typically offer digitization and metadata projects that we can do in-house. And we've been over the years expanding quite a bit what we can handle in-house. So we have 2 book scanners, a couple of flatbeds. Ashley has been working on scanning some negatives and glass plates, and you know, we've done quite a wide variety of materials, but we're victims of our own success to a certain extent. So we are finishing up grants that we gave out in 2021 currently, and that doesn't count the 2022 grants that we gave out in the spring. So we're at least a year behind. So the reason that we're not taking new projects is that it'll be at least a year before we get to them, which will be after the next grant cycle. So instead of having this really long gap where you get a grant from us to do the project in-house, and then you wait a year or more for us to actually do it, we're just going to pause. And so a year from now, we'll be accepting new projects, and hopefully the lead time will be much shorter. So you'll be able to have a start on it soon after, hopefully, you get the grant instead of having to wait such a long time. And Ashley's working to get caught up, and hopefully we'll continue to make progress on that front. So you can still go on our DigLab page and see you know, what we typically offer. If you are thinking that's something that you would be interested in and you're able to and willing to wait another year, you can kind of plan further out. The one thing I want to mention here, though, is just because we're not doing the digitization and metadata work anymore, or, you know, we're taking a pause on that, we still, if your materials will end up in New York Heritage or even New York State Historic newspapers, we will still do the upload process with you. So that's something we offer just as a service to our members. We'll do the upload, or we'll consult on the process of getting things up into the newspaper website. So there's still a fair amount of help we can give for your project. It just won't be the action of doing the digitization and metadata work leading up to that. So I know this impacts several of you more dramatically, and I wish we had better news on this front, but I think it's hitting the reality and being more realistic about what our capacity is, and it's we'll be accepting new projects in a year, so can look forward to that. I'm going to quickly give a couple of project examples. And these are just to kind of illustrate a couple of the different dynamics or like how this has worked for different projects. The first one is actually one of Tom's projects. So Oneida Community Mansion House, we gave them a grant to fund the creation of metadata. So they hired somebody to do the metadata work using funds from the grant that we gave them. So they, Tom supervised that person to do the work, and we then worked with him once it was done to verify everything and do the upload. So that's probably going to be a good option for a lot of folks this year. Of course, that required Tom's time and effort, and I did meet with Tom and that individual a couple times to do the training and making sure everybody was on the same page and knew what they were doing. But I wasn't directly supervising the day-to-day of that project. The second one's also an example of a project from somebody on this call. So OHA got a grant last year from us to digitize film reels from the WSTM TV station from their archives that they have. And they got a vendor quote from Scene Savers, which is a vendor that specializes in video digitization. And I believe they're currently being digitized as we speak. And once they get back, we'll work with them and make sure the metadata and everything is set so we can do the upload to New York Heritage. But yeah, that's, we're able to do a wide variety of things. This is probably this is the biggest film project that we'll have done in our region. But actually there's a Buffalo Broadcasters Association has a similar collection already up. And they use the same vendor. So like we can do film, film is expensive. And Jordan, at some point you should do a conference presentation or something on your process of selecting and reviewing the film, because I'm sure that you have a lot to share back on that, because I know that was a long process. So definitely more complicated than your average project, but with the a certain amount of work and determination, it's possible. The third project I have on here.
Oh, Ryan, just a quick question. Do you guys host film on New York Heritage?
Yes, we do. What I often like to do as well is have an alternate viewing location, because Content DM is a software that runs New York Heritage is a little iffy on film. So yeah. If you have a great connection, it works fine. But if your connection isn't ideal, it struggles a little bit more. So we'll like embed a link to YouTube or another repository that's better at scaling video.
Cool. Yeah, because we just had some unknown film reels pop up in the collection, so that'll be great.
Cool. Yeah. I'd love to see more film content. The other thing that we're looking at that I might be working with SU on is there are ways to embed videos from elsewhere into New York Heritage. We have to do some configuration to do that, so that would make it possible. What was it? Cultura, I think is called. But you can we can use Content DM to pull the video content from elsewhere, so we don't have the storage issues, and it's more seamless than having a YouTube link in the metadata below the object. Definitely options for that. So the third project is a very common type of project. This is a newspaper digitization project from SUNY Poly. It took them 3 years to digitize the collection that they had. I think they did about 60 reels of microfilm each go. And in 2022, we finally gave them, I think, the last stretch of that. And so if you're digitizing for microfilm newspapers, we work with our partner council, Northern New York Library Network, to the north of us. And they run the New York State Historic Newspapers repository, but they also do digitization of microfilm. Their backlog might be even longer than ours, though. So like, don't be prepared to be patient to get things up. But it's cost effective, and they'll you ship them the film, the microfilm, they digitize it, they ship it back, and then you wait as it's processed through their logistics. So yeah, that's also a pretty straightforward application to write. You get the permission from whoever owns the copyright on that newspaper title, and then it has a clear audience and a clear use. So a lot of the rest of it's pretty straightforward. And Rebecca, I didn't even realize you were on here, so you must have snuck in later on. So I'm glad you had a good experience working with us. I see you in chat. Rebecca's been great to work with on this project. And it's the nice thing about an iterative project is you write the grant once, you make your pitch, and we might be able to give more or less each year depending on what we have available, but it's a straightforward project, and some of those are the quickest ones that we discuss when we're doing the review. So yeah, thank you for your offer, Rebecca. I appreciate you jumping on. So really quickly, I'm going to go through the grant timeline because I do want to go through the actual application, and I'm taking a little longer than maybe I should be on these slides. So the first deadline you see on this slide, and these are also listed on the website, is January 20th. I ask that if you do want a private consultation, if you do want to meet on Zoom or in person to discuss your project, just reach out before the 20th. So it's not so January 30th, the day before they're due, there's not only so much I can do to meet with you and help. I'd rather do consultations a little bit further out. So as soon as you decide you need one, reach out, we can get it scheduled. And then, January 31st is the big deadline. That's the application deadline. So the Google form, which I'm going to go through in a minute, isn't too crazy, I hope. But make sure you have that in on time. In the course of the month of February, we'll have the Library's Resources and Services Committee review, and then the External Committee will review. The CLRC board meets in late March to approve those recommendations. And usually as soon as possible after that, unless I have follow-up, I will announce the recipients. So the grant period, can start as soon as we give you the news, and then we will mail out checks, as soon as we can after that. There's a grant agreement that we ask everybody to sign, just making sure everybody's on the same page in terms of reporting and the timeline and all that. So as soon as that's set, we can mail out checks. And then a year from now, end of January 2024, you'll have your interim report due. This is really quick. This is where are you? How much do you have left to do? Kind of report, just a check-in really. And then we ask that the projects are complete by June 30th of 2024. So you basically have about 14 months or so to complete the project. Some projects are done immediately, and others, again, take a little bit longer. So we just want to make sure that everything is moving along. Without deadlines, some things never happen.
Question, if I may.
Yeah.
It says also that all money must be expended. What happens if it turns out that the quote you got, you actually ended up being a little under what the grant was then because it, for whatever reason, took less work? Or what happens if it turns out that something was unforeseen and it costs actually more than the grant? What happens then?
Well, this isn't so we give you the money up front. So we do send the check in advance. We don't ask for financial reporting after the fact. So if it comes in under budget, we just would ask that you use the extra funds in a similar purpose. So, kind of, more of a, honor system on that front.
Mhm.
And if it's dramatically over budget, then you might pause or stop, and that might be an occasion where you wait and ask for a continuation grant to finish up the project. So we have had that happen before, but it's not as common. So again, it's really important to have a realistic budget because we don't obviously don't want you under budgeting and having be on the hook for a larger amount. But a lot of times you're working with a vendor, there's mechanisms in place to prevent you from going over budget.
Yeah.
You might get less accomplished, which is unfortunate, but then you ask for a continuation grant.
Then it kind of falls under that larger project breakdown you had mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. And the best laid plans, you expect to get so much done, and sometimes you get more done, sometimes you get less, and we understand that. We just want to try to be as realistic at the outset as possible. Good question.
Thank you.
So I am going to go through quickly the application. So this is the grants page. Hopefully you've at least been on it once or twice. We do have some helpful information on here. So at the top, we have an application worksheet, which is a Google Doc, a Word doc that corresponds to the application. This is really helpful if, so you can basically determine your answers to the grant questions in advance and then copy and paste them into the application. There's a vendor list here that these aren't necessarily vendors that are endorsed by the library councils, but these are often ones that have been used in the past by others. And if you want more specific recommendations, you can reach out to me and I can either give you my own recommendations or ask around. The application itself is right here. And of course, you can ask me questions. The timeline that I had in that slide is right here. And then you can see the last 3 years of projects just to have a sense for what else has been done. But I'm going to go through the application. I'm going to zoom in because it can be small. Everybody see this? All right, see the text well enough. So it's a Google form, and the stuff at the top is really just your contact information. Should be pretty straightforward. We do allow for the submission of more than one project. So if you have projects that will result in 2 different collections or 2 different sets of materials, then you can apply for them separately, and then you can rank them. So if you really want to do a newspaper project and that's your top priority, you can indicate that to us. But then you have a photograph collection that you're hoping to process too. You can submit that separately and say it's a lower priority. And the other thing that sometimes gets confusing is if you're doing a project that involves metadata, you don't need to submit a separate application to do the metadata. Think about it more in the set of materials that are being processed. And sometimes it's like a set of related materials. Like it might end up with more than one collection in New York Heritage, or more than one newspaper title, but it's all a similar set. We can evaluate them together. It's really when you're talking about apples and oranges, like a newspaper project and a photograph collection, that you might submit 2 applications. We do encourage, although it's not required, if you want to collaborate with another institution, there's a space to indicate that. Of course,
Question, if I may.
Yeah.
The other institution, does it also have to be a member of the Library Resource Council, or can it be independent from that?
No, it can be independent. So a lot of times this has been, we had a Manlius Library applied for grants a few years running, and they were working with Manlius Historical Society, which is not a member. The materials were from Manlius Historical Society, but the library was handle a lot of the activities and a lot of the work. So it wasn't just like complete pass through. We would discourage that to a certain extent. But if it's true collaboration, or if materials are split across multiple places, that would be a good time to do that. No, they don't have to be members.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Of course, everybody here can, whether you're here in live with me, or if you're watching this FFF, can check that you've attended or viewed the webinar. But you can also do a private consultation. So this is the meat down here, the project description. So the title is helpful to kind of, that's what we refer it to. So anything short, descriptive, doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be anything catchy or clever, just like digitizing the Syracuse New Times newspapers, that's a bit, or, something like that. Doesn't have to be anything crazy. The one sentence summary is helpful. This is your elevator pitch. So if somebody, hopefully everybody's reading these, applications entirely, but if we're just referring back to them and like, which project was this again? Your one sentence summary will give you the quick version of it that we can, refer to quickly. The next question, describe the materials your project will make accessible. So this is like the what of your application. So what are you working with? What are you doing? And it is helpful to have a quantity. What this often would be, so like you're digitizing yearbooks, you might say we're digitizing 75 yearbooks from this year to this year. You don't have to go crazy with like the detail, but it's nice to know a quantity and like specifically what you're doing, and not just saying we're going to digitize some photographs, because sometimes like that begs more questions than it answers. What photographs, what's in the photographs, how old are they, what format are they? There's a lot of other questions that we would have if you just said we're digitizing photographs. So the next question is about copyright status. Describe these materials. We believe these materials to be in the public domain because they were published before 1927, or these materials are under copyright, but we're sharing a piece of them for educational materials or for educational use. So we're making a fair use argument, or we own the copyright because our institution created the works as a work for hire, something like along those lines. And there's a really good resource from Cornell, the copyright in the public domain, which I will include when I share out the stuff here. That's really helpful for determining the copyright status of materials. And the next one is just really having you say definitively what it is. And this is a general statement. So if most materials are in the public domain, I would check that. The question above is really explaining the question below here. And we really do want the documentation that you whatever documentation you might have in advance, so that we can attach it to your application. I do sometimes have to chase people down for this, and it's really important that we have it. Why should these materials be made available? So like, what's your argument for the importance of these materials? Why are they significant? Why should the broader population care, to put it like bluntly? The next question, does your project promote diversity, equity, or inclusion? This isn't a requirement, but not only within New York Heritage and New York State Historic newspapers, but in the broader online repository environment. There's a real shortage of materials that depict underrepresented groups, so we of course want to do our, projects that make an effort to address that, or to, to increase the exposure of underrepresented groups is really helpful. That being said, if you don't feel like you have to really bend things to fit so you have an answer for this question, it's really okay if it's left blank. Describe the specific activities. So this is like the how. Like how are you planning to do this project? Who's doing it? We don't need a full-on project timeline, but something along the lines of, we're going to hire somebody to do this work, or we're going to send it to a vendor. These people will be responsible, stuff like that. Just relatively brief, but just to show that you have a plan for how to execute your project. Where will the materials be made available for public use? So you can check more than one here, but really it just needs to end up somewhere. And not all materials are a good fit for New York Heritage. So we funded the digitization of some sheet music a few years back for OCC, and it's interesting stuff, but would people really be looking for the sheet music in New York Heritage? Probably not. So we identified another, we worked with OCC to identify another repository that was better fit. Colgate had some scientific papers that were better fit for their own repository, so that's where they ended up. I'm also an advocate of duplicating where things end up. So if we can write metadata for your own repository and for New York Heritage, and they can end up in two places, then in theory there's twice as many opportunities for people to find them. So we can work with you on that. Describe the target audience for your project. So who do you envision using these materials? And I think this is something that's really important to me. So if we really don't want to lose sight of the fact that we're doing this for users. So who's is there researchers, students, the curious public, alumni, who's your audience? And a lot of these don't have to be long, you could be a couple of sentences, but just to show that you've thought about, these having your materials having an audience. Outline the steps you will take to evaluate your project. So we don't ask for a formal evaluation or our final report's very bare bones, but I think it's good to be able to say at the end of something that okay, have you met your goals, and how do you determine whether you've met your goals? Oh, and I see Christina just left, and we're getting to the end of the hour, so I'm going to go really quickly through the rest. I apologize if anybody else is leave. I am almost at the end, so. And then again, supporting your project after the grant period ends. This doesn't need to be a very long part of this application, but just, if you're hoping to do any kind of marketing or promotion of the materials, if you're putting it up in your repository, you want to have some plan for, maintaining that repository over time, stuff like that. The budget is, we have several different categories that we're looking for, cost breakdowns. Personnel costs, we really do want to know who's doing it, how much they're paid, how many hours. We want to be able to see your math so we can evaluate whether it's reasonable. Vendor costs, again, you'll have this right now. If you have a vendor quote, you'll have the vendor costs right there. We don't need the detailed breakdown in the application if we have it in the quote, but you can at least tell us who the vendor is and how much they're charging. We don't tend to fund the purchase of equipment for the most part. So if you need a scanner, we can lend you a scanner. If you need equipment, we can generally help you with that. And that's more efficient because when you're done with it, then we will take it back and lend it to the next person. So we'd much rather operate under that model. That being said, we have purchased equipment in the past, and if you have a good pitch for why it would be make sense for equipment to be a part of your grant proposal, we can chat about it, and I can do my best to advocate on your behalf. And then additional expenses is kind of the grab bag of anything else you might have. So of course you want to be specific when you're describing those additional expenses. And if they are, something that would have a quote or some other documentation for them, include that as well. We do not require an in-kind contribution, so we don't expect that. There's no requirement that institutions put forth their own money toward a project, but a lot of times your in-kind donation or in-kind contribution is your own staff time in managing. So if you hire somebody to do some work, you could say that your in-kind contribution is supervising that person to do the work. And especially because it's not required, you can, have a really loose estimate of the value of that. But again, we're not evaluating on how much it's not like you have to hit 10% of the ask is in kind or something like that. So you could just give a loose estimate, and we don't need to see your math as much for that as we do for when you're asking us for money. The bottom of the budget, you just tell us whether what the total amount is, add everything up to the full dollar, and then let us know if you can accept partial funding. I suspect some of our projects we will, depending on how competitive this year is, we might give more partial grants than we have some years in the past. So it is helpful when you can accept partial funding, but if you're buying equipment, you can't buy half of a scanner, for instance. It doesn't work that way. But you might be able to say, okay, if we have partial funding, we might not complete this project. We might do a smaller bit of it. And if you say, okay, we'll do that, we can do half, or we can do, whatever the way that you can kind of break it down, that is helpful for us, especially if we have to make difficult decisions, have the committee make difficult decisions in funding recommendations. And then at the end, is there anything else you want to tell us? If there's anything that doesn't fit into the other questions above. And then just verifying that you have submitted all of your necessary documentation, vendor quotes, copyright, all that. And submit. When you submit, you will receive a copy of the application as well as me, so that hopefully everybody's on the same page. I do often end up doing follow-up if there's questions. So like, obviously, do your best, but like, if there's something that is ambiguous, I will often come back and say, what did you mean by this? Or can you break this down further for me? So hopefully that takes a little bit of the pressure off. And yeah, that's the application. Any final questions or anything you want me to expand on? I really do look forward to giving out these grants, and I think there's we funded some really cool projects over the years, and it's always nice to be able to give out money and be able to help people do things. And we try our best to work with folks and make sure everybody can be successful on the projects. And let's see. Yeah, and Tom mentioned in chat about a meeting. Please reach out. If you want to set up something, I'm happy to. Ashley and I can meet with you and talk you through what the project could look like. But yeah, thank you all for coming and for all your questions. And I look forward to hearing from you and discussing your projects further.
Thank you very much, Ryan and Ashley.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Bye, everyone.
Happy holidays.
You too.
Thank you.